All right, everyone, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that session. Welcome again to the day 4 of the Smart Protein Summit. Before we begin, I've been informed that I've actually been derelict in my duty over the last couple of days because I did not announce the winners of our daily quiz. So the winners for day two are Jyotsna R, Rutvij Tambe, and Medha Gupta. And the winners for day 3 are Ishu Bindal, Rashmi Banoria, and Juhi Damani. Congratulations, everyone. And I hope everyone continues to participate. The leaderboard, as I said earlier, is quite riveting. I'm going to set the context a little bit for this very exciting panel. We've talked about how alternative protein or smart protein shows major promise to make a hugely positive impact on all kinds of climate and environment challenges that we face globally and in India over the next decade. Deforestation, ocean acidification, species loss, greenhouse gas emissions, ocean dead zones, pretty much any climate problem that we care about, UN and other scientists say that industrial animal ag is one of the top 2 to 3 causes that we should be thinking about for these. So today's panel can speak with authority about the need for smart protein innovation over the next decade to take India from scarcity to abundance and to steward our planetary health. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. Firstly, Shloka Nath serves as Head of Sustainability and Special Projects at the Tata Trusts. She's also the Executive Director of the India Climate Collaborative, led by a group of philanthropies and focused on accelerating India's development while exceeding climate goals. Shloka has a background in print and broadcast journalism with organizations like the BBC and Forbes, and she's an active angel investor and mentor to social enterprises. She has degrees from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Shloka. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Varun. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Secondly, Rajesh Kasturirangan is co-founder at Socrates, a fascinating organization bringing together expertise in cognitive science, data, and design to create collaborative solutions to wicked problems like climate change. Rajesh is a mathematician and a cognitive scientist, really fascinating background. He brings an interdisciplinary approach to his work, combining mathematical theory, philosophy, and experimentation. He's also a prolific writer, and we've co-written something before in the past across print and web, and he has a PhD in cognitive science from MIT. Welcome, Rajesh.
Thank you, Varun. Lovely to be here.
Also joining us at the crack of dawn from Boston, so thank you so much. Thirdly, Stalin Sharma is co-founder and managing partner at Green Artha, a climate-focused innovation firm and investment fund. She's also the founder of Clean Tech Women's Innovation Network and the climate editor for Business India. She has a background in clean tech, leading early stage investments and setting up India's first clean tech incubator and accelerator at Sangam Ventures. Starlene's work scaling Orphans International and Better Future International to 7 countries has received awards from the UNDP and several national governments. Hi, Starlene, welcome. Okay. Lastly, Ranjan Kumar Ghosh, Professor Ranjan Kumar Ghosh is an assistant professor at the Center for Management in Agriculture at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, one of Asia's best business schools. He has worked as an advisor and consultant to the government of India and multilateral agencies, which we will talk about later, international research institutions and global foundations. His interests lie in the interface of sustainable food systems, transformation, and natural resource management. And he holds a PhD in resource economics and has published his research in reputed international journals. Welcome, Ranjan.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
Wonderful. Okay, let's dive right in. So firstly, a round of questions about what each of you do more deeply. So Shloka, first you've identified a major challenge impacting India's future, that less than 10% of philanthropic funding today goes towards climate change. Would you tell us more about the work you're doing at the India Climate Collaborative, the platform of philanthropies you've brought together to align India's development with sustainability?
Sure. Thanks, Varun. And thank you for having me here today at the Protein Summit. Well, it's a long story, but in October 2017, that's really when it all began. It's when I came on board to set up the sustainability portfolio at the Tata Trust, and we discussed how we might galvanize Indian domestic funders to act on climate change. At the time, climate-focused philanthropic funding in India was low, only a tiny fraction of the total philanthropic funding in the country. And the Indian climate movement lacked the support and involvement of Indian philanthropy. So we realized very quickly that the full potential of philanthropy was going to require a collective approach. Efforts on climate change were uncoordinated, individual philanthropies were at different places in their climate journey, and learnings were unevenly distributed. So the ICC was really created to enable broad-based, collective, coordinated climate action. We believe in the power of many, which means that if you're going to move from the act of giving to solving, then philanthropy can no longer be a solitary activity. So no single actor, no matter how large, has the capacity to take on, complex socio-economic development challenges. And the key benefits of a collaborative, of course, are to mitigate individual risk, to be greater than the sum of its parts, and to enable ideas and missions to scale. So with this in mind, the ICC works at the nexus of business, government, research, and civil society using philanthropy as a conduit to enable action. We play a unique role as a convener and a connector. Since collaboration is so critical to our mission, we create opportunities for our network of partners and other organizations that we know to come to the same table. And we landscape climate actors to drive attention and resources to underfunded sectors and organizations. And perhaps the most important, we use our platform to elevate climate actors. So collaboration can amplify existing voices and develop future leaders to tell the story of India through the lens of Indian institutions, individuals, and communities. In India, we're still writing our development story, and we're realizing in our country that we live in a finite world. Ultimately, we depend on the natural world for every mouthful of food that we eat, and indeed every lungful of air that we breathe. So our work in building the ICC is to really help domestic funders realize the power of who they are, who they already are, and of coming together. And we realize that each and every funder must be a ripple that creates a wider ripple, so that ultimately we can bring about together a sea of positive change. The ICC finally is now, a network of 30 funders and nearly 80 technical partners. Organizations like ours really have to use the power of collective action to slowly pivot and steer that immense ship that is the climate ecosystem. And that's the task before us.
Thank you, Shloka. It's really immense, really wonderful work. I'm going to move to Starleen. At Green Earth, you're building a network of innovators and funders to support climate-focused technologies. And that includes accelerators and entrepreneurs. So what kind of network and initiatives have you been able to build in this area thus far? And I realize, by the way, that there's many, many things you've been doing in your career.
Yes, so at Green Earth, we really are operating with many of the same fundamental premises that Shloka has discussed. But we're looking at a different part of the ecosystem, or perhaps a larger cross-section of the ecosystem. So when we started Green Earth, we really started with the idea that the sector is vast and that the problems are vast. And there's a lot of people working on it, but a lot of us are working in silos. There seems to be a separation between NGOs and for-profit, social innovators versus commercial innovators, entrepreneurs versus corporations, policymakers, and then there's also divisions across interest areas. So we often don't see that people working on water are working with people who are working on land use, even though there's really, really significant overlaps. And so part of our work at Green Earth is really looking at how do we leverage the existing actors and the existing work that's being done within the sector to really achieve and accelerate the outcomes that we need. And I personally started the Cleantech Women's Innovation Network, which is a network of over 250 odd women that are looking at climate innovation from the perspective of technology, policy, climate finance, and so forth. My co-founder at Green Earth started the Women in Investing Network, which is again a 250, 300 plus group of women who are all working with commercial investment vehicles and are looking at, in some cases, topics like climate. But beyond that, we really look at partnering across and working with existing networks and existing groups. So for example, we work with ICC and Shloka, and her team is really fantastic to work with in terms of what is happening in philanthropic funding. We work with different groups that have corporate networks, and we work with corporates directly. We have networks that within government that we're using. And then there's groups like the Sustainability Mafia that are really looking at working with entrepreneurs across the spectrum. And so we work with and support them as well to make sure that they're getting the types of support that they need. And then we work with partners like the Good Food Institute that are really kind of going deep into sectors. We understand that we don't have like this deep level of expertise. And so we're building these structures with the idea that, for example, if we're working with Good Food Institute and we see that there's something really fascinating happening in, say, green building, right? And there's lessons that can be taken, we look at how do we make those types of connections. And then well beyond like the work that we're doing with networks, we also really look at how do we create virtuous cycles where we're bringing in resources and facilitating partnerships so that the action is taken forward. And our approach is really based on this idea of meeting people where they're at and leveraging their skills and interests because we want more people involved. The problem is too big, like Shloka said, for anybody to try to solve it on their own. And so our view is really bring people together where they're at with what they want to do and create the forums so that they're doing that well and they're doing it in a coordinated manner so that we get the best outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been talking about throughout this summit, and we will as well tomorrow, about how there is, people are operating in silos. There's across this value chain of alternative protein, which by the way, alt protein, smart protein is climate tech, according to us. There's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. I'll move on to Rajesh. Socrates is a really fascinating organization. You bring stakeholders together, you co-create solutions to these wicked problems, and climate change is chief among those wicked problems. You've also worked on agri and other areas which intersect with climate change, of course. So would you please walk us through the kind of work that you have been doing with these disparate stakeholders?
Thank you, Varun. Also, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'll try to stay as sharp as possible. It's early in the morning here. So, India is a very young country. We have a median age of about 27 right now. That means that 50 years from now, most Indians who are alive today will hopefully be alive at that time. And therefore, which means that we have to imagine a future for India, which is a climate smart future. Current predictions are that lots of India may be uninhabitable at that time. And so therefore, we want to prevent that from happening. So how do we imagine India's future as a flourishing society in the era of climate change? That's one of the big things that Socrates wants to address. And we do that in a series of ways. Let me start with the most perhaps forward-thinking or imaginative way we might want to do that. So I was in Bangalore for many years. So let's take MG Road, right? And so you are sitting underneath the MG Road metro station. And let's say you draw a line of about a kilometer radius around it, and you put a circle around it. So what if, for example, you said on August 15, 2021, when you cross that line, suddenly you'll be in August 15, 2041, so 20 years later. So can we actually turn an entire city block into the future and live that future? To me, that's the kind of thing that we should be able to do. And the reason is, as a cognitive scientist, we know that people actually don't think just with their heads, they think with their bodies, they think with emotion. And so unless you have a muscle memory of the world that you want to live in, you are unlikely to be able to do so, right? And so what Socrates does is we try to create spaces in which people can viscerally feel the world that they want to create and create together. And that's what we do across a range of our interventions. So as of this moment, actually, there's most of my colleagues are in Jaipur who are trying to figure out how to recast the fertilizer subsidy. As you know, India has a huge fertilizer subsidy. We give about 85,000 crore rupees a year as subsidy to the fertilizer industries, of which about 50K, the single biggest portion is for urea. And urea's contribution to India's climate carbon emissions is about 50% of its entire transportation sector. So this is an example of a very wicked problem in which, you know, politicians will not approach getting rid of the fertilizer subsidy with a barge pole unless there's a strong reason to do so. And yet, after COVID, nobody has 85,000 crores spare change. So how do we create a win-win-win? So for example, what if we started giving that money directly to farmers? Or what if we shifted some of that from chemical fertilizers to more environmentally friendly forms of crop acceleration of various kinds? It could be agroecology, it could be different forms of organic farming. So what Socrates does is we bring together the sort of the key stakeholders in the room and see if they can align first. So alignment means that you know what the other guy is thinking. It doesn't mean that you agree with them. And so can we bring together people in a room, and that's actually happening right now. Can we bring the right stakeholders into the room so that it's in their joint interest to move forward in a different direction? And, India has a current imagination of the future, which is very much embedded in the fossil fuel economy. So can we imagine a future for India that is not doing that? So we call that green up. And that's our big project. Like, how do we green up a future for India that is not a carbon future? And in particular, in the alternative protein world, imagine, Operation Flood was a huge success, if you know. It made cheap dairy accessible to a lot of Indians. It also created a lot of wealth for farmers. Now, I'm an animal rights person, and you can imagine that there should be a way to create the same kind of prosperity without harming anybody. And so can we, for example, what would an operation flow look like, where we create wealth for farmers, we create wealth for investors, we create wealth and prosperity for consumers, and we create a beautiful future for India, but we do it in a way that doesn't harm anybody. That would be an example of a wicked problem I'd love to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And you touched on a lot of things there. I mean, energy transitions, decarbonization, all super important. And of course, alternative proteins, which is what we're talking about. So Professor Ghosh, I want to ask you about your research and other initiatives at the Food and Land Use Coalition, which is very relevant to the alternative protein sphere, and your work at United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. You focused on demonstrating the link between food and climate in a major way, right? So I'm sure our audience would love to hear an overview of the various collaborative initiatives you've been a part of across these organizations and their focus areas.
Thank you, Varun. Thank you again for inviting me. And before I begin, I'd again re-emphasize, please call me Ranjan, everyone across. It's a very heavy term, professor. So I really feel like a dwarf in front of the individual efforts which all the other panelists just shared. What I can say is that what we are trying to do here at IIM-A with this particular project and aspect is maybe a bit salient, but provide a common language, a scientific language to talk about food and land use changes as we would expect in 2030, 2050, and come up with several scenarios. What essentially with this Fable consortium we are trying to do is that we are 21 countries, under the leadership and umbrella of UNSDSN, Guido Schmidt-Traub, Jeffrey Sachs, and IIASA, and Potsdam Institute of Climate Change, is that we are trying to work together, 21 countries. We are trying to integrate our data, all the countries on one platform, and we are trying to model our algorithms. We are trying to align our data basically to see if we can achieve common global targets, which we call as Fable targets. So which basically, achieving, I won't go into the details, and probably in the next phase, you're going to ask me, so I'll share some results from what we have been doing. But basically, how can we set some food security goals? For example, zero hunger, by 2050, low dietary disease risk. We set goals for greenhouse gas emissions, temperatures below 1.5 degrees, for land use change, for biodiversity, for deforestation, net zero deforestation, freshwater use, nitrogen release from agriculture, phosphorus. So for all of these, what we said, basically we set common global goals. Now this is very ambitious. Nonetheless, this probably provides us a language where we try to see, we model very scientifically using very complex mathematical models and see if we can achieve that, assuming, and what are the scenarios which lead us to that. And if we achieve that, and all the countries are tied together with trade flows, you see, so agricultural export from one country which is being imported by the other country. So makes it very complex, but brings us closer to reality than what a layman would speak, or what individual non-integrated models would talk about. And then we see if we can achieve that goal, how can we backcast, and what would be the policy pathways to achieve those? See? So that is kind of creating an ideal of what would be, but it's very complex. 21 countries bringing the data together. But then, what will the policies be? What could the policies be to achieve that goal for all countries? For example, India and China, we trade with each other. There is so our projections show that greenhouse gas emissions globally can be met, but China has to reduce its soybean imports, right? So how does, what kind of policies China should have? Or if we are missing our targets because of our palm oil imports, then, can we do something about it? But all of this is, mind you, not separates, models and results in silos, but these 21 countries, where Europe, EU is one of the biggest blocks, of course, is coming together and bringing the data and, trying to find an equilibrium there. So it's an ambitious exercise, but I think, it's an interesting exercise to actually come up with a common language where we can start talking to each other. That is what we are doing with this Fable framework.
Yeah,
We'll talk about it later.
Yeah, we're going to talk about how we don't really have a frame of reference for all of this stuff. But for now, I think I want to zoom in purely on alternative protein for the rest of this panel. So I'll stay with you, Ranjan. Last year, as part of those economic scenarios you just mentioned that you've already been working on, the global report from the Food and Land Use Coalition that you just mentioned identified a diversification of protein as one of the 10 critical transformations that need to take place, right? So could you talk a little bit about the economic future scenarios described in this research for the diversification of protein specifically?
Yes. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So FOLU has, these 10 critical transitions, which are basically targets, which are again ideals. So one of them is achieving protein diversity and also healthy diets. So one of the foundations of this entire SDSN-led Fable and FOLU work is basically the Eat Lancet recommendations, which I am sure a few of you may be aware in terms of the Eat Forum being led by Walter Willett from Harvard Medical School of Public Health, coming up with these recommendations in terms of how we can achieve healthy diets and giving up the breakup of macro and micronutrient contents and basically coming up with a plate. Essentially, one of the recommendations at the bottom line is basically that to achieve sustainable pathways, to achieve sustainable development goals, and also healthy diets and food security, we need to move towards plant-based diets. The question is, what will be the impact of moving towards those plant-based diets? How can we achieve those goals? And what are the scenarios, which would look like, which would essentially look like in 2030 and 2050, is what we are trying to do as part of this modeling exercise. So at the end of it, achieving healthy diet based on Eat Lancet recommendation is one of our core, objectives. So it's not a side objective; it's actually one of the core objectives. As you know, FOLU has, the pathways FOLU and Fable assume is we will have either, substitution of animal-based protein, through plant-based protein, and also go towards more industrial production of non-meat meat, that is clean meat, if you will. So in this integrated platform, basically we come up, we put in all the data, we do an integrated analysis and compare between current trends, that is business as usual. If we keep on doing what we are doing right now, what will be the scenarios in 2030 and 50? And if we have a sustainable path, that is, we make assumptions on sustainable parameters. For example, most important of that is following EAT Lancet recommendations. So we have to look at our results inversely, in the sense that we have to see what gains we are doing or not doing by following EAT Lancet recommendations. So we plug that in our model and then compare it with the current and alternative scenarios. So which is basically following an alternative protein path. What is the overall outputs? So I'll just talk about, because I think this portion you had mentioned in the briefing notes is mostly about the GHG and the climate aspects. So I'll talk about a little bit about our biodiversity and our water output later in the next part. But here I'll just touch upon the GHG output. So compared to the current scenarios in 2030 and 50, if we follow the EAT Lancet recommendations, that is, we move towards plant-based diets, then we make significant greenhouse gas emission gains to the extent of it. For example, in the current trend, we expect from FOLU, which is agricultural, forest, agricultural, food and land use sector, if we expect 1,140 metric ton of GHG emissions in 2030 and 1,550 metric ton CO2 in 2050, out of which majority, that is 70% comes from enteric fermentation, right, from livestock. That gets cut by 1/3, yet achieving the food security objectives, yet achieving the deforestation objectives, yet achieving all the other fabled targets. And that's the beauty of it. That's what I'm saying. All the 6 or 7 fabled targets, we meet that, yet we cut our greenhouse gas emissions 1/3, and that too globally. I mean, this is the results are for India, but I'm saying that achieving GHG 1.5 targets globally, we are able to cut down our GHG emissions 1/3. So just to give an example of the power of what we are trying to do, is trying to basically give very sound scientific output of if we follow the EAT Lancet recommendations. Similarly, the emissions intensity actually can be brought down by 33 to 35% from the 2005 baseline data by again moving towards measures which help us meet our EAT Lancet recommendations, which means basically reductions in livestock products, increased feed use efficiency, and a dietary change, and of course also increase in bioenergy production, because energy is integrated in this body. So this is what we are saying. Now the question is, for the case of India, and I think this is the last minute I'll take before I hand over. So in India, it is not simply a trade-off between between plant-based protein versus animal-based protein, but it's a trade-off between food security versus food insecurity. So we know that India food security is a major issue, and most of our children and people and population in general are deficient in macro and micronutrients. So how do we also meet that? Is it possible? So here I'll refer to a parallel work by some of our colleagues at IIM-A, though I'm not personally involved with that study, led by Narasimha Rao and some of our other fabled colleagues, is where they come up with different reference diet scenarios, different dietary scenarios. And they say that if we allow substitution between meat with vegetable protein, we can still achieve 25% reduction. This is not an integrated model result, but still we can achieve very high reductions in carbon emissions by moving away from rice to wheat, maize, bajra and ragi, and from beef and eggs to chickens and legumes. Cost, and they do a cost calculations based on NSSO data. They say cost is not a hurdle to eating more nutritious diets. Yeah. Overall, eating wheat and coarse cereals instead of rice, pulses, instead of meat. So they do a regional analysis. They do a dietary analysis. There's a paper in Global Environmental Change. You can refer to that. And dark leafy vegetables and coconut could achieve, alleviation of deficiencies at a very affordable cost. So ability to pay actually is not going to be a problem. If we design our policies properly, if we look at this properly. So moving towards traditional diets, what here is missing, I think, in my last sentence before I leave, in the broad work which we are doing at the integrated platform and what Eat Lancet and others, researchers, it is a very important field actually coming up, already a lot of work. What is really missing is we don't have clear-cut scenarios and output and results for alternative protein coming from industrial production of clean meat. So we have results from traditional diets, shifts to traditional diet, which is of course very important, but we also need to think about alternative protein coming from industrial non-meat production of meat. So that is a very important, I think, future research area. And with the kind of models, with the kind of platforms we have set up, complex platforms to handle some of these questions, I think eventually we will be able to do that. And we are always looking for people interested to support that kind of research. I'm sure with that we will be able to come up with some more interesting results in the next year.
Absolutely. Thank you for diving so deep. Much appreciated. So we're gonna do a little more rapid fire from now on. Shloka, much of the current climate discourse is justifiably centered on what I described earlier: energy transitions, electrifying the transport grid. Now, you've been working on essentially increasing the size of the pie, the overall size of the pie that goes towards climate funding, right? We argue that alternative protein is a white space within Planetary Health in terms of funding dedicated to it, et cetera. So without thinking about this from a competitive space, thinking in terms of abundance, in terms of the size of the pie, how do we go about mainstreaming the cause of alternative proteins within that climate space?
That's a great question. And it's an important one because India, like any other developing nation, is predicted to rapidly increase meat consumption as our economy advances. And like you said, there are a whole host of issues associated with industrialized animal agriculture, especially with cows, methane emissions, antibiotic resistance, deforestation, water contamination from their waste, all of those things. And so I think one of the things that people don't realize is that changing your diet away from meat and dairy products can actually make a big difference to your carbon footprint. It's one of the bigger differences you can make, just below purchasing an electric vehicle or switching to green energy. And compared to all of those, in my opinion, it's a simpler change to institute, especially when you have these alternative proteins on that market that come pretty close to replicating the taste of real meat and dairy. I actually heard a story the other day about a Japanese master chef, Hidekazu Tojo, the man who invented the California roll. And he was shocked because he tried this vegan Wagyu beef, a Japanese delicacy, and couldn't tell that it wasn't meat, which is incredible. Mainstreaming alternative protein will rely primarily on consumer-focused communication. And the good news is consumer-focused climate campaigns already involve eating less meat as a big part of their outreach. So there is space for alternative proteins to come in and make the point that you don't actually have to sacrifice your protein intake or your health in your shift to a sustainable lifestyle. Influencers and public personalities have a role to play in shaping consumer preferences or perceptions, and have already done so with respect to climate action. So getting a diverse set of them to commit to eating alternative proteins in place of meat as a step towards a greener lifestyle could lead to great results, especially those that you traditionally expect to be non-vegetarian, like sportsmen or weightlifters or anything in that arena. And I think another part of it is that it's really just spelling things out for people. Our food systems and supply chains are so convoluted and opaque that it becomes really easy to separate the food on our tables from the long string of implications attached to it. But intuitively, it makes sense, right? Agriculture uses up about 80% of fresh water in India. So if you're using all of that water to grow crops, to then use as feed for meat, it's an incredibly inefficient system. And India's climate story is closely intertwined with water. We're already in the midst of a water crisis that is projected to grow more severe as the planet warms. We're making choices every day that we think begin and end at a grocery store, but clearly they don't. It's about exposing those systems and making it unavoidable for consumers to face the reality of how much their food really costs. And finally, at the end of the day, climate action is really about protecting ourselves, our families, our children, and grandchildren. When you frame your choices or these choices through that lens, eat vegetarian protein so that your grandchildren can live in a world that isn't torn apart by natural disasters and water scarcity. It stimulates a shift in perspective.
Yeah, I love everything you said, with the exception of, I think it's too early for the consumer to make the choice just yet. I think we still have to make it much easier for the consumer on the basis of taste, price. I think we're still far away. There's a lot of work to do in that regard. I have a question to Starlene about that exactly. Some of this transition will depend squarely on startups, because big business may not be able to get involved early on and take the risk unless there's a market pull that's demonstrated. Now, this is happening internationally, but in India, we're still in utero, not even in our infancy, we're in utero in this sector, right? So you've been successful with getting some impact investors to think seriously about climate tech acceleration. What kind of arguments worked best in your favor for that sector? And did you have to present some kind of bull case for that technology? What learnings can you transition over here?
There we go. I think the first thing to think about when you think about how do you crowd money into a sector is really to think about the spectrum of capital that's available. And so for a field like sustainable proteins, you have a phase where you're looking at R&D capital, you're looking at grants, and then as the companies grow, equity and debt becomes much more relevant. There's another angle when you think about capital that is really important to think about, particularly for an area like sustainable proteins, which is looking at whether it's financial capital or strategic capital. Are people choosing to put this money or philanthropic capital? Are they choosing to put the money in because they want to see an impact? Are they choosing to put the money in because they see a big business opportunity? Are they putting the money in because they think they're going to get a financial outcome? And really thinking about that piece is the first half of the equation. If we're asking the wrong people for money, it doesn't matter how good our story is. It doesn't matter how good our pitch is. It's not going to get there. And then when we've identified like where we think that a particular technology or product is in its development cycle and what type of capital it needs, then it's really about talking to that same investor so that they can see a line of sight to the outcome that they want, right? If I'm a financial investor, I want to see a financial return. If I'm a strategic investor, perhaps a corporate, I want to see that there's going to be a market for this. And so I would be looking for signs of like early adoption. If I'm a person who's putting money in from a philanthropic perspective because I think this is a great place to be, or I'm putting in impact capital because I think it's a great place to be, I'm going to be looking to see those shifts in impact. And so really being prepared to spell out some of those pieces, I think is very important. And so then the next piece is really looking at, from the perspective of sustainable proteins, like what are the tailwinds and what are the headwinds so that you can start to shape that story. In India, we have this massive market. We have a lot of people who are already vegetarian. We have a propensity towards fermented foods. We like our achar. It's not that a day that goes by that you don't have achar on the table when you're having an Indian meal. And so there's already a lot of positive tailwinds. But the flip side is we also have some headwinds, right? Some of our native grains or some of our native animals are much, much better sources of protein if we're going to look, if we're going to think about, a desi cow versus a non-desi cow, for example, from a sustainability perspective. Not that I'm advocating cows, but just from that perspective, but the flip side is there's a propensity that I've found where when we look at native grains or when we look at these sort of native animals, we think of them as less good. They're not aspirational, they're poor food. And so we need to look at how do we shift the dialogue around some of these native grains or these native products. And we have a lot of mechanisms to do that. There's an increased focus on health consciousness. There's a very young population that is much more interested in social and environmental issues. We have a growing number of celebrity chefs from India itself who are saying, I'm going to devote my restaurant to incorporating different native grains. And so if we start telling those stories and start making these better sources of food, aspirational, we start having the levers that can shift the dialogue so that we can start moving the conversation ahead. And when people start the movement, you start creating like a critical mass or a snowball effect where it's much easier to move. And so really mobilizing your early adopters, promoting the early adopters, popularizing that, using things like influencers and whatnot, as well as these sort of market conditions, I think really creates sort of that bull case that you're looking for when you want to think about smart proteins and selling to the consumer.
Absolutely. Rajesh, I wanna switch track a little bit and talk about kind of incentives, because you mentioned that the Green Up is at the center of the work that Socrates is doing. This big initiative called the Green Up, of which the fertilizer subsidy recasting is one piece. Why would we succeed at convincing people that economic benefit aligns with climate? It hasn't necessarily succeeded in the past, right? So a lot of these actors across the food system, there's a need to convince them that public health, climate, and economic benefit are not on two sides of an issue, that they can coexist with each other or benefit from each other.
Yeah, thank you, Varun. Let me also use this opportunity to give some propaganda for myself. So go to greenup.substack.com and sign up to our newsletter right now. Right. I think I find this debate between growth and environment kind of strange, and I'll tell you why. Right. So suppose if you look at the history of economic growth until 1947, or at least certainly through the 40s and 50s, pretty much every country that had become powerful in the capitalist system was a colonial power, right? They had colonized other parts of the world, and that's how they grew. In India was a supplier of raw ingredients, not the finished products, right? So if you said that is growth possible without colonialism in 1947, well, we know the answer now, yes. You can become a more prosperous country without colonizing other parts of the world. It seems like a no-brainer. So humans are smart species, and if you give us the right incentives and constraints, we'll figure out anything we want to do. And so I just don't think there's any issue. And we are a very young country, and we need to imagine the future we want to be in. And so that's really the purpose of Green Up, right? So just as the independence struggle said, we want to imagine India as a sovereign nation and the kind of society we want to create at that time. And so why not imagine India as a green and flourishing society 50 years from now, and create the right incentives to get there. I feel like that's, and also the kind of technologies that we need to get there. We have some natural advantages. So for alternative proteins, we already have a good thriving biotechnology sector. We, of course, as Starlene also mentioned, we have a history of culinary choices and dietary choices that are friendly to alternative proteins. So I feel like part of this is in imagining the end space, where we want to be at the end of this journey, and working our way backwards from there. And I think if we can create an imagination that seems compelling, I will let the 1,000 flowers bloom from that point onward.
Shloka, I have a question about, you work with corporations and you work with philanthropies as well. And I think there's a lot of cynicism about corporations in general, and whether, things like voting with your dollar as a consumer can actually work. Why would I be incorrect about that? Why would people's cynicism about corporations be incorrect about that? You're on mute.
Just realized I'm on mute.
Typical days of 2020, yeah.
No, it's a great question, Varun, but I have a couple of thoughts or answers to that. And I think one is just, from the perspective of the role that the private sector is going to play in a country like India. And I think the most important role that they can play right now is to work alongside the government in developing a resilient economy by supporting existing programs, and to demonstrate to them that we are ready and willing to shift gears as a state and as a nation to a greener future. So to give you an example, the World Economic Forum released a report in July this year, which estimated that over half of the world's total GDP, which is about $44 trillion, is potentially threatened by anthropogenic or human damage to our natural environment. So on the flip side, they've identified key systemic transitions that could offer a gain of up to $10 trillion that would create about 400 million jobs by 2030. So sustainability is really no longer the isolated cry of activists and nature enthusiasts. It's the future of the global economy. And we have arrived at that pivotal moment where it falls upon us to decide whether we're going to catch that wave, or are we going to continue to look to an outdated model of development in order to predict our future. I would also argue that large Indian businesses are increasingly focused on climate issues. So like most economies, business performance on climate action in India can really be classified as a few leaders, a large number of those who comply, and then you have some laggards as well, of course. The leaders in the business space are usually, it's the same usual suspects that are seen across all climate commitments, whether it's RE100, EP100, internal carbon pricing, etc. Over 38 large Indian businesses have signed up for these norms, and it's the largest number for a developing country, actually, for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, especially. Unsurprisingly, this group can also be found on the ICC website. But it's because the climate ethos that runs throughout these organizations, and it's really driven right at the top. So this group, the way we think about it is that this group could really be used as an effective peer-to-peer engagement tool in the business community to reassure government that they will support strong climate action and build capacities of suppliers in their value chains. For the laggards, especially in heavy industry, a stronger mechanism in terms of government regulations does need to be applied and enforced. But I will say again that in the pre-COVID era, Indian CEOs had increasingly begun to recognize the risks that climate change poses to their businesses, but also to the opportunities to innovate on products and services. And the great news is that the pandemic has not dampened climate ambition. Over 20 major Indian business leaders across numerous sectors, including technology, manufacturing, energy, real estate, they've all signed a statement that's a call to action to repurpose business activity towards green growth. It's referred to as the CEOs for the future. And it really identifies or calls out 8 different priorities for businesses to work with government and civil society to deliver changes on sustainable growth. You also have 6 prominent Indian industry players across sectors as diverse as energy, cement, who've signed an industry charter for near zero emissions by 2050. And they sort of, this was launched at Climate Week just a couple of weeks ago that's hosted every year in New York by the Climate Group. So they've committed to a vigorous set of decarbonization measures. And, I could go on with the list of sort of examples. I think the things that I want to point out are, India is already the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And so even optimistic predictions suggest that our emissions will nearly double in the next decade or so. So green recovery could be designed to ensure that India's post-economic resurgence becomes a key contributor to mitigating global emissions. And it has to be branded as the single most important initiative for the world to meet and exceed Paris Agreement goals. In fact, I often go as far as to say that India should really market itself as the destination for all recovery funds and startup funds globally, which means driving the Indian government to actually move forward on clean energy goals with the incentive to think of cleaner and greener as actually being financially more viable and attractive. And that's where the private sector has to really lead. We need a narrative change from the ease of doing business to the ease of doing climate. And that requires, of course, a whole host of things from policy stability to rethinking our energy subsidies, to prioritizing clean energy access, international signaling on our climate commitments, as well as a narrative that balances mitigation goals with the principles of inclusion, sustainability, justice, and equity. Finally, and this is to your last point, corporations in India are definitely motivated by consumers, but also they are also motivated by the risks posed to their organizations by climate change. And new opportunities posed by a green transition, employment, for instance, being one of them, wanting to be the cutting edge as well of any new transitions, those are opportunities that we have to expand. And there is a global, the global market is shifting towards nature-based solutions. Carbon tax, for instance, means that you have to be sustainable in order to be internationally competitive. And I think it's good for the big guys who started doing this, but I will also just point out that the MSME sector really, really needs help. And that's where we kind of have to come in and sort of support those initiatives. And that's what we're hoping to do at the India Climate Collaborative. So I'll stop here, but hopefully it's answered your question.
Yeah, and Shloka, pulling up on some of the things that you mentioned there and some threads from Ranjan's points earlier as well, when he dove into the data there, a significant portion of that emission is, in fact, I don't even know if we're modeling this, if we're pricing this in yet, but a significant portion of that is going to be increased egg, meat, and milk consumption. I mean, if you talk to large QSR companies, they will tell you confidentially that consumption of meat has already gone back to pre-COVID levels. So this whole scare about chicken transmitting COVID and all of that, which was perpetuated on WhatsApp and things that are not very reliable, wasn't actually very persistent, right? It stopped. Like this idea that we've entered a new normal with consumers, just not true, right? And I think we have to enable these choices and make it much more simple. The great thing is in alternative protein internationally, not yet in India, you're seeing 9 out of the top 10 US meat producers investing in alternative proteins. There are business incentives to do this as well, in addition to the climate incentives. So they're all seeing the promise of that. Starleen, we're actually almost out of time. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm going to leave you with the last word. Specifically on alternative proteins, all of these technologies seem to go through this kind of Gartner hype cycle that looks like this. So initially you have a ton of hype, and then you kind of get into a trough of disillusionment if you don't have rapid success. In a couple of minutes, could you tell us why alternative proteins could or couldn't go through that same trough over the next years?
I really think it's going to be very specific to individual products. Ultimately, especially with food, consumers know what they want. And these hype cycles are very often generated because of marketing. And marketing generally does one of two things. It sells this big idea and leaves it vague enough that people can imply all of their own wants onto it, or it makes very specific promises and overpromises but underdelivers. Now, when you're looking at IT solutions, it's fine because the process of changing is a very fast process. If I send you an app, you try it out, you don't like it, I can see very quickly what the problem was, I can make the change, and the barriers for you trying it out again are very low. Whereas with something like food, the barriers are much higher. So if I sell this big idea, you try my product and you're like, oh my God, that's horrible, you're not gonna try it again. Or, oh my God, that made me sick, you're not gonna try it again.
This is an inauspicious place to stop you, but I'm afraid that I have to because we're running out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation with all of our panelists. Please reach out to them. They're doing fascinating work across climate. I'm afraid we have to pull this session to a stop, but my apologies, Starleen. We can take this forward independently with our guests here. We've had about 1,400 people today. So thank you so much for your time. We will talk to all of you soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Nice.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.